evaluación del impacto de la COVID-19 en la delincuencia a corto y largo plazo será moderada por el señor Adrián Franco, vicepresidente de la Junta de Gobierno del INEGI en México. Adrián, es un gran placer saludarte y darte la bienvenida a este espacio. Adelante, por favor, tienes la palabra.
Luisa, muchas gracias. Por tus palabras. Muy buen día a todas y a todas. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are. I really hope you and your family, your colleagues are very well at this time. Welcome to the 5th International Conference on Governance, Crime, and Justice Statistics. It's a pleasure to have you here, and welcome specifically to the session assessing the short-term and long-term impact of COVID-19 on crime. As Luisa said, we all know that COVID-19 has changed our lives. This pandemic has affected everyone's life, as well as the cycles of global and domestic economies. It has changed politics, it has changed policies, practically all human activities. Actually, and Luisa stressed, this international conference has also impacted by COVID-19, because instead of having our conference face-to-face in one city of Mexico or in some other city in the world, we are here in front of several screens and also talking about the relationship between crime and the pandemic. Since March 2020, the impact of a pandemic on countless fields have been the hot topic. Thousands of webinars, discussions, news, and manifestations show the relevance of COVID-19 in every corner of our planet. COVID has been related to health, health systems, economic performance, change in behaviors, restrictions, all types of restrictions, recovery of the nature, mental diseases, elections, even is related with the human feelings and relationships between among people, or the design of workplaces for the future, for example, the way in which we transport to our workplaces or schools and so on. Crime as a human activity is no exception. It also has been impacted by COVID-19. It is very clear that crime in general has changed its usual configuration. Preliminary data shows that common crime has some reductions in some cities, but crimes related to domestic violence, for example, or drug dealing have increased in some cities. In some countries, for example, homicides do not show significant changes, and this is a very, very important question. Why and how the crime has been impacted by COVID in different, with different parameters and in different size of the impacts. Of course, there are still many questions to be solved. How crime and COVID are correlated in the lockdown context, where most of the people, potential victims and potential perpetrators, were sheltered in their homes. Closed businesses, null activities, and where some criminal justice institutions were also closed to receive reports of the crime. So today we have a very, very important group of panelists, a very select set of experts who can help us to understand how crime has been affected by COVID-19. The central point in this session is to analyze the empirical evidence on the impact that COVID-19 had on different types of crime across the world. We would like to hear from our panelists how different types of crime have changed during the pandemic and what to expect in the near future. How the sporadic lockdowns change the configuration of different types of crime in countries or in cities, and how to measure crime correctly in the context of crime. I would like to thank to our 4 panelists for being here. So let's start with our first speaker. Our first speaker is Hervé Borrion. Welcome, Hervé. He's deputy head of the Department of Security and Crime Science in the University College of London in the United Kingdom. And welcome, Hervé. And the topic, and he's going to talk about resilience of criminologic systems to COVID-19 stringencies, an ecological approach. Hervé, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrián. What I will do is share my screen and hopefully it will work. So. Can you confirm, please, Adrián, that you can see it?
Yeah, I can see it, Hervé. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. So I'm really delighted to be here or to be with you virtually. The reason is that the topic of today is something that we have been working a lot on with a number of colleagues, and you can see a list of names here. Justin Kurland, Peng Chen, Alex Piquero, Juliana Gomez Quintero, and a number of other people from different countries. And we had a great support from different police forces as well to be able to collect data or obtain data to investigate the relationship between COVID and crime. And what I will do today is to try to deliver one key message, which is that there's a certain number of parameters that we ought to be interested in measuring and to go beyond what we have done as a community so far. And to do this, I will use a number of examples from South Korea, Japan, China, and Colombia. So I will not go into any great depth into any of them, but hopefully I will give you a flavor of what we have done. So I will start with South Korea. And the reason I will start with South Korea is that actually I have very little data at the moment because we're in the process of getting data. But what I have is data about burglary for the year 2020. And what you can see here are data points representing 50 plus weeks for the year 2020. And it doesn't seem that there's any big change, any big variation in terms of crime level, which suggests that actually burglary didn't change much in Seoul. These are data for Seoul. But of course, in order to really have the evidence to see if there's been any change, we need to have data from previous year. But the first conclusion that we can come up with is that there hasn't been much change for burglary, and it's the same for assault. So my first point really is it is important to have access to more than just 1 year worth of data to measure crime correctly. Now, I will take you to Japan and Tokyo especially, where the picture looks different here, because when you look at burglary in Tokyo, and what I did here was to plot 12-month worth of burglary data. So we have monthly data point for 2017, 2018, and 2019. That's in white. And then we have 2020 or part of 2020 up to September in red. And you can see that we now have a clear difference between 2020 and the previous years. So really we can see that in Tokyo, there has been a change in terms of crime level for burglary. And there's been a clear reduction, which, as Adrián has mentioned earlier, is likely to be due to the fact that people spend more time at home. It became more risky potentially to break into people's home for burglars. Now, if we look at a different type of crime, which is snatch theft, so people who are in the street and have their bags, for example, taken away by someone, then you can see again 2020 data in red and the 3 previous years in white, and you can see a clear difference again as we have seen for burglary in Tokyo. Now, the explanation is not necessarily that people spend more time at home and therefore it becomes more risky, but simply that there may be fewer people out in the street. These are part of the things that we will have to explore in more detail with my colleagues. Pickpocketing is where we can find the greatest difference. Again, the year 2020 in red, the 3 previous years in white. And what we can see here is that when at the month of April, then we had almost no pickpocketing incidents in Tokyo. Now, the explanation here could be the same as for snatch theft, meaning there are fewer people in the streets and therefore fewer targets for offenders to get their goods from. Now, there's another possible explanation is that pickpocketing is a crime that requires people to come very close to their target and stay there potentially for a bit. It's easier to commit when you have crowded environment, which again may not have been so easy during the pandemics when people were trying to stay away and apply social distancing rules, so away from others. So again, each type of crime has its own set of plausible explanation for why they have changed in 2020. Now, all these elements are interesting, but there's a number of other points that we ought to look at. And what I will show you here is the work that we did in China using data from a large city, which I cannot name, so we'll call it M1 city for this presentation. And what you see here are daily data, which provides us with much greater resolution. It's not very nice on the screen, but you can see that we have, again, the 3 years before 2020 in white and then in red 2020. And we can clearly see that in the first part of the year, crime has gone down. This was for all kind of theft. And then eventually around April, it started picking up again. And that's something that I will explore a bit more later. But we can see this element that for property crime and theft in particular, we have this reduction in crime, which is very clear in China and in Japan, at least for the cities that I've shown you, that happened in 2020. So the type of analysis that policymakers may want to see, or the type of results may look like this, where you have you have a number of data points that represent immediately by how much the crime reduced, and then over a certain period, so for example, the lockdown period here in China, in this Chinese town, how many crimes did not happen, for example, so reduction in crime rate. And so what we did here was to break down the crime into different types of crime: fraud, theft of electromobile, burglary, pickpocketing, theft from auto, bicycle theft, motorcycle theft, and auto theft. And you can see a very clear, what I hope is a very clear summary of the reduction with respect to this type of crimes. Now, the main point that I'm going to make now is that this is interesting, this is useful, but we shouldn't stop here as a community, because behind these data points, which often are indicated in tables, there's actually something a bit richer here. If you look at these time series here, you can find the same type of crimes which we have analyzed in this Chinese city, and you can see the green line that indicates when the lockdown started in this city. And you can see that the trajectory of crime has drastically changed after the lockdown. And what is really interesting, I think, is the fact that it has changed differently for different type of crime. And please remember that here we're not talking about very different crime. We're talking about different types of theft. So for example, motorcycle theft, you can see on I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the second one is showing that it increased slowly after dropping down. But then there are other types of theft, for example, bicycle theft, where the levels stayed at the bottom for a much longer period. And in this particular slide, you actually can't see that it has picked up, and this stopped around May, June 2020. So that shows the importance of not just looking at summary numbers, but also looking at the shape of these crime time series. So what we did after that was to try to come up with a a framework that would really allow us to capture the nuances of this variation that was experienced in crime level in different cities. And so we looked at, again, the same city, and this was back in February 2020 when we started, and we drew on the literature from ecology and resilience. And if you read what has been done looking at how different ecosystems and animal communities respond to disruption, what you find is that there's a kind of general pattern which shows that after a disruptive event, so what we have here is a graph that shows the crime level on the y-axis and then the time on the x-axis. And so after a disruptive event, we have a series of phases. So the first one ends with this, what we call the departure point here, which is when, in this case, crime starts going down. And then eventually it lands at a certain stable state, which is called the landing point here. Then it stays there for a while until it reaches the ascent point where it starts going up again. And it will go up to a point where eventually it will be stable again. So that's the recovery point. And what you may have in between is this restoration point, which is when it reaches a level that is equivalent to the level that it had before the disruption event. So what is really interesting with this idea is that we now have a time series which can be split into different phases. And from this, we can start measuring a number of indicators. We can use, for example, the time between the disruptive event and the departure point. So the time they took for crime to go down after the disruptive event happened. Another indicator could be how long it stayed in that trough. How long did it stay at the bottom of this diagram? Or when did it start to rise, and how much did it rise by, and so on. So that gives us more than a dozen indicators that we can use to describe what happened to crime in a certain place. And of course, once we have this, we can compare different cities, we can compare different types of crime, we can compare different neighborhoods. So it gives us a much richer picture than just looking at, did it go down or did it go up? And so we did this for different types of crime. I will just show you a very quick example, but what the type of questions that, for example, the police forces that we work with were interested in were, how quickly did crime go down? How much did it go down? How long was the trough? How long did it take to reach a new stable state? What new level did it reach, and how does it compare with the previous level before the pandemic? How many crimes did not occur in comparison with the forecast? And this idea of forecast is something that many researchers who've been working on this topic are familiar with. It's this idea that in order to really understand what happened to crime, we need to be able to understand what would have happened if 2020 had been a normal year. So we need to be able to create a forecast, or what's called a counterfactual, that shows what the situation would have been in normal circumstances in 2020. And of course, another one, which I'm not sure many people look at, are did temporal patterns of crime change? And so we applied this technique to retail theft data from that city in China. And what you see in red here is the famous counterfactual, that forecast that tells us what is it that would have happened if 2020 had been a normal year. And why this is interesting here, because the lockdown in China coincided with Chinese New Year, which means that crime would have gone down anyway. And what we can see here is that crime has gone down much further, much more than it would have had 2020 been a normal year. but at least we can see the difference between the two. And when we compare observed data with the forecasted data, we can then obtain the difference between them and see, if you want, the crimes that had not occurred. And we can take this and come up with a model, which you see here, which essentially expresses how crime has changed during the different phases. Now, the beauty of this model, I am tempted to say, is that it's a very simple way to represent the different phases using linear approximation. But it allows us also to record the indicators that we want to be able to describe these different phases and be able to then compare crimes in different places. So I will finish with just an application, which is now the work that we're trying to do in Colombia, and we're using this we're planning to use this this framework to look at different types of crimes in Bogota, Cali, and Medellin. And so, just move this here. What you see here are different, so that's for theft in these 3 cities, and we have the forecast, we have the actual data, and we can see that there's been a fairly similar response to this type of theft from the person in the 3 different cities. But what is really interesting is that when you start breaking down this crime category, theft from the person, into its constituents, so robbery, opportunistic theft, snatch theft, and pickpocketing, you can actually see that pickpocketing, which is indicated in blue here in Bogota on the top figure, it took much longer for pickpocketing to recover. Whereas robbery, which is in red, came back not to its original level, but close to it very, very quickly in comparison. And what is interesting is that robbery is conducted or attributed to criminal gangs usually, whereas pickpocketing isn't necessarily. And so you can understand, in fact, how many or what the resilience of the different type of offenders is in the different cities. Another element which is really interesting is that if you look at Cali, which is the figure at the bottom, it shows that pickpocketing followed the same kind of slow trajectory compared to robbery after they started to pick up again. But a few weeks before the numbers rocketed in August and September, we can see that pickpocketing started to go up very, very fast before the other crimes. Now, don't ask me how to interpret this, because we're not completely sure at the moment, but it's interesting. It's an interesting observation and something that we're going to check in other cities to see whether the same pattern has been found. And one of my last slides is, again, the same approach also applies spatially. So this is Bogota and robbery in Bogota. You can see the different neighborhoods of different comunas in Bogota. And each comunas has its own crime trajectory. And again, in order to be able to explore the differences between these different neighborhoods, we need to be able to have a set of indicators that will allow us to do this fairly easily. And so here, for example, we can see that the recovery level in the different neighborhoods was very different between those that were close to Santa Fe in the top center here and those that were at the periphery. There seemed to be a spatial pattern here, which is worth exploring again in order to understand what needs to be done. And again, having that framework that tells us what are the data points that we need to look at, what are the indicators we need to look at and compare, is something which can help us, not just individual researchers, but the whole community of researchers trying to understand what happened by being able to compare all our data sets with each other. So I would like just to thank my colleagues and collaborators, and also acknowledge UCL's funding and EPSRC funding, especially relevant here as the Grand Challenge scheme of UCL is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hervé, for a very interesting presentation. The model for analyzing the point of departure and recovery is very, very, very interesting. And of course, we can apply to several cases. Thank you very much, Hervé. Let's go with our second panelist today. In this panel, Fatma Usheva. Hello, Fatma. Welcome. She's a survey specialist at the Data Development and Dissemination section at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. And Fatma is going to talk about measuring national levels of crime during the COVID pandemic. Fatma, welcome, and the floor is yours, Fatma.
Thank you very much, Adrián, and thank you very much, Hervé, for your great presentation. I think let me just share my screen now, please. Do you all see my screen? Yes, I assume.
Wait, Fatma, it's loading. Yes, we can see.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, so thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined this session on the short and long-term effect of COVID-19 pandemic on crime. One thing I would like to add to Hervé, just to support his statement, that is we indeed need more data and of course more granular data in order to really assess the level, the effect of COVID-19 on crime around the world. So I strongly support that statement, of course. What I'm going to do in my brief presentation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the UNODC work, what UNODC has done at the very beginning of the pandemic. So my presentation will be focusing the first few months of the pandemic and what we have observed. And in general, this presentation will be aiming to look at global trends, if we can actually say something at the global level. So the contribution of this is to look at the crime levels in different countries and different forms of crime, and to try to assess whether there was an emerging common trend across the world. I'm having some problems. Okay, so just a brief agenda of my talk. I will talk a little bit about the UNODC COVID data collection. As I have mentioned, we have collected data at the national level on various forms of crime during the first months of the pandemic. I'm going to briefly talk a little bit of how do we expect COVID-19 to have affected crime, and why do we even think that COVID-19 pandemic could have affected crime. And my presentation will focus on findings on 3 forms of crime. We're going to look at homicide and what has happened to homicide in various countries around the world, for which data, of course, was available. We're going to look at property crime. And finally, I'm going to also talk a little bit about violence against women. Of course, violence against women was one of the most discussed topics during the course of the pandemic, and it still is. So at the beginning of the pandemic, UNODC launched an ad hoc data collection that happened in the end of April 2020, and the data collection continues even today. Of course, we were hoping that this pandemic would be over in a couple of months, but this did not really happen. We are still in a pandemic all over the world, and many countries are still under a lockdown. The idea was to assess the immediate effect of COVID-19 on drugs and crime. So we collected both data on drugs and crime, although my talk will be focused on crime. And as I said, it is a global data collection to provide a global overview, if we could actually provide any global overview, or if there was some common emerging trends across the countries. Here I have listed some of the crimes we have collected data for: homicide, homicide, physical violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, property crimes. We also have data on cybercrime, prison, etc. And I would like to mention that our data is available on our webpage at data.unodc.un.org. So you can actually go and download all these data that you're going to see presented in my presentation and do your own analysis. Before we go into actually the results, I would like to also mention the data limitations and challenges in measuring crime during the pandemic, and not only, of course. So our data collection, as in many other data collections, and is based on administrative crime records. So the administrative crime records, the advantage of this type of data is that it's regularly available. Most of the countries actually record, of course, crime statistics. However, the problem with administrative records is that they describe only the crimes that are reported. And we know that a significant part of the crimes are actually not reported to the authorities, and some crimes are actually more underreported than other types of crime. For example, the exception is homicide. So in the period of the pandemic, we have an additional problems. So because the effect we observe, if we observe any effect, any changes in the level of crime, could be because there is a change in the commission of crime. So there is actually lower or higher level of crime, depending on the type of crime we're looking at. There is also a change in the reporting of crime, and this is especially problematic, right? Because now certain people may be even more reluctant to go and report the crimes, or they may not even have access to reporting mechanisms, because we know that criminal justice institutions have been closed and law enforcement, actually human resources, have been redirected towards enforcing lockdown measures. And we also could think that the effects during the pandemic or the lockdown period could have been also partially driven by a change in the recording and detecting of crime by the authorities. So these are really important limitations that we have to keep in mind when we're discussing this type of data, administrative crime level data. Another limitation is that oftentimes countries produce crime statistics in broad categories. So sometimes, for example, burglary, we have a broad category of burglary, but here we may have observed during the COVID pandemic a decrease in private homes burglary, but perhaps an increase in commercial premises burglary. We cannot tell that because many countries report these broad categories, but I see, of course, you could also obtain from some countries, you could also obtain more granular data that could tell us a little bit about how crime has changed. A solution to this, in the previous section of this conference we were discussing, a solution to this could be a representative population surveys that will really allow us to disentangle the different effects, because we'll be asking people about their experience of crime. So we'll be able to observe how crime has changed in terms of commission of crime, and we could ask people about the reporting of crime. So crime victimization surveys, representative crime victimization surveys will really complement this analysis, and we'll be able to say what has happened and to really quantify these three effects based on such surveys. Okay, very briefly, because it was already discussed, how do we expect a priori that the pandemic could change crime or affect crime? The main channel we're looking at is, of course, the lockdown restrictions that countries have enforced. We know that different countries have imposed different lockdown restrictions, but even if they had the same lockdown restrictions, they were enforced to a different extent. So on the one hand side, of course, we are thinking that at the beginning, after the lockdown is introduced, we may have a decrease in the opportunity to commit crime, and that was already discussed. Of course, people are staying at home, so there's reduced opportunities to break into private homes, there's reduced opportunities for shoplifting, theft, robbery. There are also reduced opportunities for violence outside the domestic sphere. However, it is also important to mention that there are possibly an increased also opportunities for violence inside the home, as it has been the discussion for violence against women. So on the one hand side, we should expect, or we are thinking, a priori that we should observe a decrease in the number of crimes after a lockdown has been introduced. And as lockdown restrictions are lifted and opportunities become available to criminals, we should observe that crime goes up. Now, how quickly, that is another question. On the other hand, we also have the so-called strain theory, which predicts that perhaps we may observe an increase in the number of crimes due to accumulated strain. For example, stress, aggression, depression may cause more people to commit crimes. In the long term, which is another question of what will happen to crime in the longer term, we could think that socioeconomic strains have the potential to drive individuals to commit crime. We know that unemployment and loss of income may affect crime because they decrease the opportunity cost of committing crime, and hence more people may actually opt for criminal career. This might be particularly relevant where economic and social safety nets are not sufficient to ensure livelihoods in certain countries, or in particular groups of the population which are more likely to lose their jobs or lose their savings, or fall into these categories, socioeconomic strains, and experiences socioeconomic strains. Okay, so let me get into the results and what we have seen from a global perspective. First, from intentional homicide, we have data from 21 countries in different regions around the world. These countries are not selected based on any criteria, but solely on data availability at the very beginning of the pandemic. And what we saw is that there was a heterogeneous impact of COVID-19 on homicide. We indeed saw that some countries experienced a decline in homicide, whereas in other countries there was not really any visible change. But even if countries experienced a decline in the homicide during the first months of the pandemic, these were only short-term effects. And let me show you how this looks like. So the red line here, it represents the trend in the number of homicide victims in 2020, and the black line together with the light gray line represent the trend since the year 2015 to 2019. And you can clearly see that from the descriptive evidence that in Colombia, we observed a decrease right after the lockdown here was introduced on 25th of March, and the same we saw in Guatemala. We also saw a big decrease in South Africa and Kazakhstan, as you can see in the data, compared, of course, to the years before. On the other hand, we have Mexico here, that we didn't really see any big change in the trend of number of homicide victims, whereas Brazil, at the beginning, before the pandemic, the trend was going up, and then after the introduction of the lockdown restrictions, the number started going down. So these heterogeneous effects were actually observed not only, of course, in other regions of the world, in Europe as well. We saw a slight decrease here in the trend of number of homicide victims in 11 European countries. However, this, of course, effect was different in different European countries. So it was not, we can't really draw a global conclusion that homicide has gone down during the first months of the pandemic. Contrary to actually homicide, what we saw for property crime, and by property crime I mean robbery, theft, and burglary, we saw a significant decline in March and even more so in April, when most of the countries experienced their first lockdown. We have data from 22 countries located in 5 different regions around the world. And the decrease was visible in most of the countries under consideration. It is important to point out the decrease was larger in countries with stricter lockdown measures, which is what we actually expect from the opportunity theory. So once you have stricter lockdown regimes and people are less likely to move, they'll be less exposed to opportunities to be victimized or to commit crime, and you should expect a larger decrease in those countries. However, it is also important to stress that this decline could be a result of both a decrease in the crime committed and a decrease in the crimes that have been reported to the authorities. And this is actually how the data looks like. This is the trend in the number of reported property crimes. So we have here theft with the red line, and the blue, dark blue is burglary, and light blue is robbery. And you can see this big dip that has happened starting in March, the decrease, and the deep reach its peak in April. However, this trend started going back to its pre-pandemic level immediately after the lockdown restrictions were lifted. Our data ends here, but we are currently collecting more data in order to extend this analysis and to show what has happened after the month of August. Finally, violence against women. I think violence against women doesn't really deserve a lot of introduction on my side, because it has been one of the most discussed issues around the world. What we could certainly say is that restricted mobility has indeed kept women at home, increasing their risk of victimization by intimate partners or other family members. The lockdown measures can affect violence against women in two conflicting ways. We could have an increasing strain at home, so women could be more victimized at home, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that there will be reduced exposure to crime outside the home. Our data is limited, so the assessment you're going to see here is based on a limited number of countries, and we cannot really draw any conclusion on global trends, and we cannot really say that violence against women has gone up or has gone down all over the world. What we see is that the reporting of rape and sexual assault has decreased in the period of the first lockdown. We also use the helpline data in order to complement the administrative crime statistics we collected. And what we also saw with helpline data is that in some countries, more women reached out to helplines. But there were also cases, and there were also countries where we did not see any change in the number of women reaching out to national helplines. And I'm going to show you now how the data looks like. This first chart shows the trend in the number of rapes and sexual assault recorded by the national authorities. In 21 countries, we have number for rape, and we have 15 countries with available data on sexual assault. And you can see you have this big dip in the number of reported rapes and sexual assaults in April, and soon after the restrictions were lifted in most of the countries, the numbers started going back to pre-pandemic level. Helpline data instead, it's a complement, fantastic complement to this analysis. On the left-hand side here, we have data from Italy, which plots the number of weekly calls to the national helpline. And you can see that with the introduction of the lockdown measure, there was a spike in the number of calls received by the national helpline. On the right-hand side here, we have data from Denmark, which is represented by this purple line. And contrary to the Italian case, what you see in Denmark is that with the introduction of the lockdown restrictions, the number of calls did not really change significantly. If anything, it went down, and then it started going up actually right after the lockdown restrictions were eased. So just to conclude with my talk, an old tale retold, it is really important to analyze data from different sources as they may tell a different story. And what we have seen is that timeliness of data is essential for effective crime prevention policies. We cannot wait for years in order to obtain timely data. The data has to be now if we want to design time effective and crime, of course, effective prevention policies. It is also very important to have disaggregated data, geospatial data, because looking only at national data does not really tell us where the problematic areas of countries were. So geospatial data for targeted policies is also very essential. In general, I would say we really need a more granular data to distribute resources efficiently and effectively, and to do a very good analysis of what has happened to crime during the COVID-19 pandemic. with that, I will thank you for your attention, and you can take a look at all our research on our webpage and the various publications we have produced on the effect of COVID-19 on crime. Thank you.
Fatma, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. Of course, it's very comprehensive, not just from the point of view of the data, all the data that you collect around the world, but also because of the model in order to explain what is happening, and mainly the restrictions and limitations when we collect data and when we analyze data. Thank you very much, Fatma. Let's continue with the third panelist. Our third panelist is a very old friend of this conference, Manuel Eisner. He's a Wolfson Professor of Criminology and Director of Violence Research Center in the University of Cambridge at the United Kingdom. And Manuel is going to talk about short and long-term trends in police recorded property and violent crimes in 24 cities worldwide during pandemic. Manuel, welcome again, and welcome. Thank you very much, Manuel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so can you see the slides?
Yeah, we can see, but if you put in presentation mode, please. Yeah, correct. Thank you, Manuel. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your introduction. It's a great pleasure being here. I mean, it's sad that we can't meet in person, but it's still fantastic to be at this conference, which has grown so enormously over the last years. As you can see, I will talk about short and long-term effects of COVID-19 on crime. And as you can also see on this first slide, I'm not just talking on my own behalf, but there is a long list of co-authors, and I will soon explain where this list of co-authors is coming from. When the lockdown started, Amy Nivette, who is a former PhD student of mine, and I soon started to think, just not having anything else to do during the lockdown, that it would be really interesting to better understand what may be happening during the lockdown. And so we came up with this idea that one way to think about this theoretically would be to distinguish between the effects of COVID-related regulations, on the one hand on opportunities like social control and routine activities, and on the other hand, the effects of strains, inequality, unhappiness, anger, fear, and stress. One of the things that I would like to say is that when it comes to regulations to control COVID-19, it's a little bit misleading to talk about the lockdown. I think it's really important not just to disentangle different types of crime, but also to think about the different measures that have been put in place at different times, affecting different types of people in different ways. In some societies, for instance, there have been alcohol bans. In other societies, there have been travel bans. In other societies, there have been stay-at-home orders. And in other societies, there have been school closures. And each of these measures have different effects on crime. So this was the basic model. And then there was this next idea that when you think about effects of either strains or opportunities, these effects may happen at different time delays. This is the basic idea that when you have an external effect on a human being or on a community, that there are some effects that happen very quickly, maybe in seconds, minutes, or hours, and maybe days or weeks, and some other effects are delayed by maybe weeks or months or years. And so the idea was that maybe there was a short-term effect through opportunity reduction, and then strains gradually build up, people become angry, people become frustrated, people become disorientated, and these strains build up over time, and they may actually continue in the time when the lockdown is relaxed. And I think this is maybe an interesting thing to think about, and it relates back to Hervé's question, whether we will see crime levels to go back to what they were before lockdowns, or whether there will be something happening that leads to higher crime levels once the restraints are relaxed. So what we did was to bring together colleagues, send out lots of emails and ask colleagues, do you have contact with police forces in your place? And would it be possible to share current up-to-date police data? The strategy that we chose was not to go for national data, but to go for city-level data, because it was clear to us that it's very often in many places, it's cities that, or city municipality level police forces that collect the data, and it may be easier, more effective to collect these data. It's also probably a better idea in terms of comparability of the data than looking at country level data. So this graph just shows you the countries that we included, and you will probably be pleased to see that quite a few Latin American countries were included in this analysis. We just published the results of a first paper in Nature Human Behavior, and this shows you the list of co-authors on this paper with a large number of scholars and academics from Latin American countries. And I just want to briefly summarize what we found there in 2 slides. So the first slide, sorry, this is the second slide. This was the first slide. The first slide, and that's already been said, was that overall, all forms of police recorded crime that we analyzed declined. This is not a long list of crimes, and the reason for this is that we limited the analysis to crimes that we could match across the cities using UNODC criteria, so that we could be reasonably sure that they were comparable. The decline was overall stronger for opportunistic street crimes. You can see in the table, for instance, that robbery and theft declined by almost 50%, 46% for robbery and 47% for theft. And then there was also decline for burglary, vehicle theft, and then there was almost no decline overall for homicide. So overall, the message is there was a decline by about a third overall, with more decline for opportunistic street crimes and less decline for homicide. And the second really important thing was that we found that there was a strong association between the stringency of the lockdown and the extent to which there was a decline. After some analysis that Amy Nivette conducted, and I think that's the right conclusion, we concluded that probably overall, that would have to be looked at differently for different types of crime, that overall the main active ingredient in the lockdown was the stay-at-home orders. So they are the ones that it looks like across the sites that we included, these were the elements of the lockdown that had the strongest effect.
Vimos diferentes indicadores y parece ser que a nivel general.
Now I get the translation. Okay, good. So this was the strongest. So what was the next steps? The next steps was that this was an analysis of the first, broadly speaking, 100 days after the beginning of the first lockdown. And as we all know, we now have second and third lockdowns in different places. And in between, we have periods when there was, if you all remember, in August, September last year, at least in Europe, people were going out again, going on holidays again. And so there were all kinds of questions here for criminologists. What happens when the lockdown or the stay-at-home orders are relaxed? Is there evidence for a backlash so that there are pent-up strains or tensions that are released. And then the question, what happened during the second phase of the so-called lockdown. So what we've been doing over the last 2 months, I believe, is that we went again to the colleagues that are part of this group. And if anybody is interested in joining, you're more than welcome. We sent out a new request to continue the data collections. We're focusing on daily crime counts. What I will be showing you is series that are smoothed by 7-day or 30-day averages, depending on how frequent the crime is, just to get a little bit rid of the noise in the data. And what I did, just for illustration purposes, is to standardize each series by its own mean, meaning the average of 2019, setting this to equal 100. This is a relatively simple way of constructing a counterfactual. One can do more complex things, but that's just a way to make all these series comparable. And I've plotted this for now against the Oxford University Government Response Stringency Index. There are different measures that one can use. This is the overall stringency index that combines different measures, but it would also be possible just to focus again on the stay-at-home orders. I'm focusing now on 5 cities, and you will be seeing lots of little wiggly curves in the next few slides. I'm focusing on 5 cities that differ in the extent of stay-at-home stringency index, starting from Barcelona, Mendoza, Guayaquil, Montevideo, and then Stockholm. So I'm starting with Mendoza, which probably had, Argentina probably had some of the most stringent lockdowns and stay-at-home orders of any country in the world. And this just shows you the stringency of the overall lockdown measures. And what you see now is coming in are the measures of property crime. And you can see that immediately after the beginning of the lockdown, property crime goes down, and then it comes back up again. So I'm now repeating some of the things that Hervé was already showing. So there is a decline, and it comes up again, and it comes up again almost to pre-lockdown levels, although there is still quite a lot of restraints on daily behavior. What happens to violent crime? Now, violent crime shows a lot less of a decline over the period, and very quickly it goes back up to pre-lockdown levels. And there is even evidence, if you use 2019 as a backdrop, that by the end of 2020, levels were actually effectively increasing, not just for domestic violence, but also for assault and rape, above the levels that we saw in 2019. So that would be consistent with the idea of a backlash of some pent-up aggressiveness that is now showing up. So I'm now going to show you Barcelona, which also had a very rigid regime of stay-at-home orders that were very strictly enforced with heavy penalties. And you can also see here that then after a while, this was relaxed. And then there was again a return to more rigorous measures. And what you can see here is that during the first lockdown, there was a strong 90% decline in all property crimes. And then it comes back up again very quickly, but it stays much lower than it was in 2019. Well, there is probably at least one simple explanation for that. There are still no tourists in Barcelona. And tourists are probably a big driver of a lot of opportunistic property crime in the streets of Barcelona. But again, there is some evidence suggesting that there was something like a peak during this brief period of relaxation. And the same holds true for violent crime. This is assault, sexual abuse, and domestic violence. Again, with a fast return to pre-lockdown levels during the few weeks when Barcelona saw less controls over daily behavior. The third example is Guayaquil. I'm just showing you one line here, mainly for theft, robbery, and homicide. And again, you can see a quick decline during the first weeks. It's only a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and it starts going up quickly again. And during the few weeks, again, in August, September in 2020, there was at least some evidence that there was a return to relatively high levels, especially for homicide. Montevideo, within the Latin American context, as you will all know, was a country that had a relatively liberal policy in respect of the lockdown, and it also had a different trajectory in that the first lockdown was less rigorous, and then beginning in December and early 2021, there were more rigorous measures, including also some stay-at-home orders that were not merely recommendations like in the first wave. Now, it is interesting, though, that in Uruguay, in Montevideo, we see relatively little response, either of property crime or, and this is now, this is already Stockholm, or of violent crime. We have domestic violence here as one of the indicators. Now I'm going to show you Stockholm, and then at the end, Helsinki. Stockholm was probably within Europe by a long distance the most liberal regime. Stockholm had some constraint measures, and you can see here the stringency index, but Sweden never had any stay-at-home orders more than recommendations to stay at home. There was never an order by the government to stay at home. So what happens in this country during, or in Stockholm during this period? We have relatively many data here. So I'm first going to show you property crime. And as you can see here, nothing happens. It just stays the same. And the same is true, by the way, for violent crime. There is very limited evidence for any systematic change in crime levels in Stockholm. Now, there is one suspicion which I think is important to mention, namely that maybe in Sweden and in other societies where you have possibilities to submit a crime electronically via an online portal, the crime goes down less because there are fewer obstacles to reporting crime to the police. I want to end with Helsinki because it has this interesting rise in lockdown, in stringency, then a decline again, and a rise again. So quite a strong fluctuation in the extent of measures to control COVID. Now, first of all, I show you assault. I'll show you both assault and theft. Now, one of the things that you may notice here when you look at the assault rates is you can see these spikes. They basically look like little civil wars in Finland. The Finns actually call this New Year. And so around New Year in Finland, there were always these massive spikes. There was no spike in New Year 2020, 2021, because public gatherings were not permitted. But you can also see here that there was, during the period when the measures were relaxed, crime levels increased above the average level of 2019. So this brings me to the conclusions. First of all, I think there is emerging evidence. I mean, let me just start by saying, I think it's becoming really increasingly important to think systematically about what is going to happen after the constraint measures are being relaxed. And there is some evidence suggesting that it may actually become a big problem. Crime certainly quickly returns to previous levels when the most stringent measures are relaxed, and there is at least some evidence for a backlash effect, probably especially for violent crime. And it will be important to better understand what is happening there and for the police to respond adequately to such a possibility. It's interesting also to see that the second lockdown, but again, it's composed of a variety of different measures, also resulted in some crime decline, but the drop was much less than during the first lockdown period. And I think at the moment, we don't really understand whether that was simply because there was less dosage in terms of the restrictions on daily life, or whether the consequences that the measures have on people staying at home wore off. And especially for people with delinquent intentions, there was less likelihood that they would comply with the lockdown regime. Just one last remark, and then I'll stop. And it bears on the question of what we are seeing when we are looking at these crime declines. Now, many of us, including myself, will be saying, well, this is fantastic, we see a decline in crime. But I do think we also need to think about how we construct our measures. Because we know that the number of people on the street declined by maybe something like 70, 80, or 90%. And so I think, in addition to just measuring how many crimes were there per day, we should also think about measuring the number of crimes per person possibly exposed. And I'm saying this because I think it would be really interesting to better understand what the risk was for a person, for instance, who had to travel to a hospital during the lockdown, of being robbed or being a victim of some other opportunistic crime. And I'm not yet convinced that for a person who had to go outside, the risk of becoming a victim of a crime was really less than it would have been before the lockdown. Thank you very much.
Manuel, thank you. Thank you very much. Really an interesting presentation. Of course, what you said, it is true. It is not just a general conception of lockdown, but specifically all the restrictions are different drivers for different results in the impacts of COVID on different crimes. As you show in your presentation, we have different results, of course, of those different restrictions, not the general conception of the lockdown. Other thing is that maybe it's the paper in which I have seen many contributors. It's very interesting, the paper. And at the end, you said something that is very important for the audience of this conference. We have to take care about how we construct the measures, the rates, because of course it's not the same when all the people is moving outside homes that when people is inside home and there is no many people outside. So the probability change, the possible victims and possible perpetrators change, and the rates of course have to be changed. So this is a very challenging issue in our measuring. And finally, I would like to also thank you for your contributions to this panel, Manuel, with the Center of Excellence. I know that you were the person who proposed the panel and you helped the center to organize this. So thank you very much, Manuel, and thank you very much for your contributions for the presentations. Let's go to the final but not least the panelist, who is my colleague, Oscar Jaimes. Oscar, welcome. Oscar is the General Director for Governance, Crime and Justice Statistics at the National Statistics and Geography Institute in Mexico, the INEGI. And Oscar is going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on crime and he's going to show some data from the Mexican case. Oscar, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Adrián, for the introduction. It is an honor to participate in this panel with Fatma, Manuel, Hervé, and of course with you, Adrián. Well, can you tell me if you can see my screen?
Yes, Oscar, but if you put in the presentation mode, please.
Yes.
Yes, we can see it. That's it, Oscar. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I will show some data about the COVID-19 in Mexico. Then I will move to indicators of perception of insecurity in Mexico, also victimization, and finally about harassment and sexual violence in public spaces in Mexico. And then I will move on to the conclusions. First, the COVID-19 in Mexico. Well, this graph shows weekly confirmed cases in the blue line and dots, the light blue, and the darker one, the deaths by COVID-19 per week, as I mentioned, during 2020 and 21. It's important to mention that in March 30, Mexico enters a health emergency and a suspension of non-essential activities is declared. This ends by May 30, and there is a gradual reactivation of non-essential sectors from that time on. Then the cases and the deaths begin to drop around July, but then again increase about October. And by week 51 in December 2020, Mexico City returns to red light, and along with state of Mexico and other states like Baja California in the north of the country. In the first week of 2021, confirmed cases peaked, and in the third week of 2021, confirmed deaths peaked. By then, 13 states in Mexico were on red light from out of 32 states in the country. Then, fortunately, cases and deaths began to drop quickly. And now I'm going to move to about some hypotheses about crime during the pandemic. Well, as it was mentioned before, social isolation measures to control the spread of COVID-19, lockdown measures, caused a sudden change in routine activities of people around the world. Also, opportunities to commit a crime against property, such as robbery and theft, depend in a large extent on the flow of people. Once lockdown measures were implemented, lower crime rates were expected. Those crimes in which confinement did not alter significantly, its usual dynamics is tended to remain stable or even increase, for example, domestic violence. Now, we'll review some data from the National Survey on Urban Public Safety. This survey, it's focused on population 18 and over. It's a probabilistic design, and we select private houses, and the unit of observation is the people in the private household that is selected, and the one person is selected randomly, 18 years and over, as I mentioned. The sample size is 25,500 households. It's a quarterly survey. We collect information in the first 15 days of March, June, September, and December. It includes 85 cities with estimates, representative estimates for each of them. And Mexico City is included with the 16 municipalities that it has. About perceptions, well, you can see here the series started in 2013, and by the first quarter of 2020, we had an average of 72% of population aged 18 years and over who considered that living in their city was unsafe because or due to crime. This survey shows a decrease in the population that perceived insecurity in their city from the first quarter of 2021 holds a historical minimum. It's important to mention that the second quarter, it was not possible to collect the survey because there was no conditions due to the emergency of the pandemic. But we can see here the levels that had a decrease, 68% of population that felt unsafety due to crime in the third and fourth quarter, and then 66% in the first of 2021. Here there is a disaggregation by sex. It's clearly show that women along the series had higher level of perception of insecurity. And we can see here the break in the first quarter of 2020, 79% for women, 67% for men, and then the drop. For women, between the first quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, the perception of insecurity decreased 8 percentage points, and for men, 6 percentage points. Out of the 85 cities that are included in the survey, 35 had a statistical significant change between the first and the third quarters of 2020. Only one had an increase, that was in Coahuila, and 34 had a drop in the perception of insecurity. And this range between 7 and 25 percentage points, with an average of 12 percentage points. On the right, we can see the cities with the largest significant change in perception of security. This slide shows the change for each quarter. In the third quarter, as I mentioned, 34 had a significant decrease. Here, I'm just going to highlight that 48% of the cities that we measured, remember that are 85, were in this top or high level of perception insecurity, that it is 66% or more of the population that feels unsafety in the city they live. There was not too much change in the fourth quarter, but in the first quarter of 2021, there was a new drop. 12 states went down significantly, and again, 48% of the cities were in that high level, with the difference that the first quarter of the 2020 was 65%. We also measure perception of insecurity in certain places or specific places. Here I show in public transportation with some examples. Coajimalpa, which is in Mexico City, it was in 74% of the population who feel unsafety in public transport in the first quarter of 2020, and then it went down to 53% in the third quarter, then with a slight increase in the following quarters. San Pedro Garza Garcia in Nuevo León had a similar behavior. We can see 55% in the first quarter of 2020, and then dropped to 38%, and even declined in the fourth quarter to 27%, and then went up in the first quarter of 2021. In Tijuana, Baja California, from 83%, went down to 69%, then up to 75%, and then down to 71% in the first quarter of 2021. The witnessing of antisocial behavior, we also measure this in the survey because it has some impact on the perceptions of insecurity. We have theft or robbery, which had a decline of 8% between 2020 and 2021, the first quarters, and drug dealing. Here in blue, there is the theft. I am showing it with the, here 61%, and then to 57% in the third and fourth quarters, and then even drop to 52% in the first of 2021. More or less the same with drug dealing, here 42%, then 40, and then 38% in the first quarter of 2021. It's important to note frequent gunshots, which didn't change significantly, stayed more or less in the same, 41%, then 40 and 38%. No significant change there. Now about victimization, we included a measurement of victimization in 2018, and all up to the second semester of 2019 remained stable, around 35% of households that had a victim of crime, then dropped to 22% in the first semester of 2020, and then went up to 28% in the second semester of 2020. About robbery, well, it's more or less the same. It was in 29% around the last in 2019, and then dropped to 18% of households with a victim of robbery, and then increased to 22% of households with a victim of robbery. Out of the 85 cities in this survey, 35 reported a significant change in households that had a victim of crime in the second semester of 2019 and the second semester of 2020. For those that had a decrease, this range between 20 and 49% with an average of 35%. Here on the right are the cities with the highest change, for up to 40%. We can see that. Here just have to highlight that 10 out of 16 municipalities in Mexico City had a statistically significant decrease between this period of 2019 and 2020 in victimization rates. Just to mention quickly about which types of crimes had a change, I will focus on robbery, extortion, and also on partial robbery of car or vehicle. That went down from 16 and 12.6% of households with victims of crime of this type to 8.5, 6.4, and 7.5, and then by the end of 2020 had an increase, but is still below the levels of 2019. Most of the cities that had a decrease in the perception of insecurity also had a lower rate in victimization. About personal harassment, this was included in the survey in 2019, in the last quarter, and we also measured that in the last quarter of last year, 2020. And here is disaggregated by sex. We can see how it went down from 27% of women victims of personal harassment and sexual violence in public spaces to 22% in 2020. On the right, there are the 10 cities with the greatest decrease in sexual violence. You can see that it is more than 50% the decrease in this type of violence and crime. And just to highlight that it was in public spaces. Concluding, after the first quarter of 2020 and until the first of 2021, there is a decrease in the total perception of public insecurity in Mexico. Victimization also decreased between 2019 and 2020, especially for robbery and theft on the streets or public transport. There is a decrease in witnessing of crimes and antisocial behaviors that generally take place in public spaces. Again, robberies and theft, drug dealing, partial theft of vehicle, to name just a few. And victims of sexual violence in public spaces also decreased from 2019 to 2020. Thank you very much. That's all for my part. Thank you.
Oscar, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Of course, we have been in this panel from the conceptual and global to the very local and very important data about how COVID has impacted in crime. First of all, I would like to say, Oscar, thank you very much. Would like to say thank you to Fatma, Manuel, Hervé, and Oscar for very interesting presentations and the conceptions and the ideas about how analyze this phenomenon of COVID on crime. I'd like to make also many questions from me and from the audience that we have in the Q&A section, and the question that I really would like to make to you is the $1 million question, and it's about what is the real size and dimensions of crime for the period of the lockdown. But maybe we can stay here 1 week and we cannot have the one response or one just answer to that question. So for the time, I would like just to ask you one question. Imagine the future in 2 or 3 years for coming 2 years time. Once somebody, maybe the world, or it could be the World Health Organization, declared that the pandemic has finished. So everyone and everything is going to be in the new normal or the normal, and even crime will also back to the normal operations. So everything is going to be normal, and we will see data changes, because now, for example, I have seen in several countries politicians and some policymakers that say, well, the crime has reduced, but yes, it has been reduced, but they don't explain why it has been reduced. But in some point of the time in the future, the near future, those same politicians and governors will say, well, the crime has increased. Why? Well, we don't know, but imagine that future. So my question to all of you is how to deal with the data produced during the pandemic, this whole data that you have shown, and the future data. I mean, are those data strictly comparable, or maybe the statistician, the analyst, the experts have to put this data or such data into the brackets and with that several footnotes in order to try to explain how about the series of data?